So that kind of sucked.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Good evening, friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. As always, thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day, every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more because right now new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon right now to get started. Now, if you're wondering what sucked and you somehow missed today's debacle against the Nashville Predators, well, the Jets pretty much got curb stomped. And look, this game, I know we all kind of want to burn the tape. I'm sure many of us would prefer that we just forgot it even happened. The Jets have had a few games the last few weeks where you could say they want to burn the tape, and I think that's probably not a good sign. But against the Preds, you could maybe cut the team a little bit of slack because, both Scheifele and Velarde were out. That's right, Scheifele, if you missed this game, he suddenly came down with some sort of an illness. I don't know, man. What is happening with the locker room, dude? Like, there must be some sort of fierce flu or something, man, that has got this team sidelined. I've never seen a bug run through a locker room like this, not since, like, those mumps outbreaks a few years ago. But, man, whatever is eating up those guys inside has really done a number on this team. And I think, on the one hand, I know people don't want to make excuses and we always want to hold the team accountable, but it really does seem like the Jets are just physically ailing. Against Nashville, Winnipeg just had nothing, and it was different than some of their other games where they've struggled and were just poor. This game, they physically struggled to do some of the simple stuff, make their basic reads, make clean passes, and it wasn't like typical stuff. They just looked like 10 steps behind. It was weird, and it's not like this is the first time. Ever since it kind of came out that there was some bug that kind of had been running through the team for like the last month, you sort of noticed the Jets were struggling to keep up, especially against teams that were good. So, I think against teams that the Jets could beat up on and just really pressure and hem in, no problem. But I think against teams that are faster and more skilled or they have a good tactical plan like Brunette does with the Preds, the Jets were immediately under pressure. And Bones tried some stuff tonight that I don't really think worked all that well. He definitely, rejigged the lines a bit. You saw Nemestikov on the first line. Then you saw other pairings. At one point, we saw even Connor, Monahan, and Toffoli together. I mean, there were just so many different combos. It's a little hard to keep track of, but suffice it to say, no one really had a particularly great night. Iafallo did get a goal, and Appleton had a garbage time goal, so yay. Again, if you've ever seen that meme about Chris Paul cutting the lead down to 42, that's kind of how it felt. The Jets were just struggling uphill all night. All four lines really struggled to create anything. Of the Jets forwards, I think, Lowry looked okay. Ehlers looked decent. It's hard to find praise because not many players really performed all that effectively this evening. And it was especially noticeable without Scheifele. The fact that the team kind of fell apart without Mark is, a sign of his importance, but also a little bit worrying that the team just really couldn't keep up and looked this bad. And, with Bones, I don't feel like he compensates in the right ways. If you lose like a high-end skill player, I feel like you should replace that guy at least as close to the best skill fit as you can. Honestly, I might have just put Lowry on the first line. If you're going to run that and try and make the most of it, Lowry on your first might be your best bet, considering the other centers, they're more of the middle six or bottom six variety. So overall, man, just a bit of a letdown. I mean, this was a game that I said would be a really big litmus test for the Jets, and Winnipeg fell really short. And I think it's becoming more of a trend recently that we're going to talk about in a little bit because the last few games against teams that are in the playoffs, the Jets frankly have a crap record against. I mean, it's not good. 3-8 against playoff contenders since the start of the year, and that's just not good enough. I mean, this team is definitely playing above 500 hockey. Like they're 7-3, or coming into this game, they were 7-3 in their last 10. But I mean, you look at who they're beating up on, and it's not really strong opponents. Teams that are either hovering around a wild card spot at best or below the playoff line. And so, for the Jets to not really be able to take care of business against the team that is chasing, that playoff berth and really wanting to get in and secure their wild card spot, a team that the Jets might actually play in the postseason, it's not great. And, Winnipeg has now lost to Vancouver. They've lost several times to Dallas. They've now lost to the Preds today. It's just not feeling great. The vibes aren't super ideal. And I know that the team is probably not feeling 100%. I think that much is clear. And the loss of Velarde and Scheifele is really tough. You really can't replace those guys. And so I totally get it. All that said, you look at Nashville's roster, and you would think the Jets would have been able to put up at least a little bit more of a fight, right? The Jets just seemingly lacked compete and stuff. And I do think that their whole explanation of something running through the room is very valid. I know people are very much quick to not want to give an excuse for the Jets, but I think in this case, it does seem legit, and it makes you wonder what exactly has gone wrong in the containment procedures, because the team just seemingly can't stay healthy. So really rough, very disconcerting. And hopefully, they get this out over the next week or so, because this team heading into the postseason cannot be playing like this and cannot be playing while sick. If they do, they're going to get cooked. So, yeah. All I can say is at least it wasn't a shutout. The Preds didn't really even have to work crazy hard. I mean, they definitely peppered Hellebuck and put him under a ton of duress, but it felt like it was the Jets coughing up the puck repeatedly and just being very sloppy. Unfortunately, I am going to have to single out a couple of guys in particular. Dylan and Pionk had one of the worst games I've ever seen from a pairing together. It was just, I think they were honestly responsible for most of the goals against tonight. And I'm trying not to be harsh, because I know that those guys are going to take it really personally. And, I'm sure that they're already in their own heads about it. But yeah, if we're being honest, they just had a horrendous evening. Even by some of the standards of bad games that they've had in the past, this one might actually be worse than that. So one of the worst performances I've seen from a Jets defensive pairing. If you want to talk about burning tape, that's probably tape that you would want to burn from this game, because every shift that they had just seemingly ended in disaster. And I'm sure Hellebuck felt like he was a bit like he was on an island in this game. So, yeah, really rough one. The Jets are unfortunately starting to run out of those games in hand. They've still got a couple on Dallas, but they've only got one more on Colorado. And honestly, they really do need to win the Central, because you do not want to have to face either Dallas or Colorado in the first round. That is a recipe for disaster. You need to let them soften each other up first, because if you don't, you are going to have a heck of a time making it through that 7 games. But obviously, there's a big question right now as to what the tough realities with this team are, where the roster is at, and what the likely future holds. So let's talk about that in just a moment and see if there's really a lot of concern, if the pessimism is maybe overstated, or if there's legitimate worry about where this team is going and sort of the direction that we've seen the last few games. But before we go too far ahead of ourselves and get into the nitty-gritty of that, I do want to shout out our friends and partners at Sleeper. We're almost towards the end of the season, and the Jets have kind of gone, from conference favorites to more closer to the middle of the pack to now being back in the mix for the conference title. But of course, what's more important than winning, right? And regardless of where the Jets are in the current standings, I want to remind you that you could win big by playing daily fantasy hockey on Sleeper, the official daily fantasy app of the Locked On NHL Network. Sleeper is our number one choice for daily fantasy sports, and especially daily fantasy hockey, because with Sleeper, you could win 100 times your cash in daily fantasy hockey contests. For those of you who are stats nerds and love following all of your favorite players, this is a great way for you to flex your knowledge. If you think you can predict the save percentage or plus or minus or goals and assists for a player in a given game, and you beat Sleeper's projections, whether it's more or less than what they project, guess what? You could win big, because if you get 8 of those stats categories for a given game correct, you could win 100 times your cash. That's 100 times your cash if you get 8 of those categories for a given game correct. So start paying attention and nail your picks so you can start winning big. Use promo code LOCKEDONNHL and you'll get up to a $100 match on your very first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. That's code LOCKEDONNHL. See Sleeper's terms of use for details and locational availability. While we're at it, I also wanted to shout out our friends and partners at eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. What brings home the winning trophy is also what keeps your vehicle alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more, whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one car, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for, and with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or you get your money back. With eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that victory. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. Hello, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are just sort of sorting through the aftermath of a rather bitter loss to the Nashville Predators. I don't think anyone feels particularly great about that game, and I know if you've watched it or if you've even seen a part of it, let's just say it's 3 hours of our life that I think we all wish we could have back. But it is what it is. You sign up for it when you root for a team, and you know some days there are going to be some rough ones. But, of course, for a lot of you who might be MLB fans, there is the hope and promise of baseball. And guess what? The Locked On Network has something really cool coming up that I think you'll want to hear about before we launch into the nitty-gritty of some harsh realities for the Jets. Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel, Locked On Sports Today. And baseball fans, you're going to want to mark your calendars for March 20th at 7 p.m. Eastern for the best MLB season preview coming exclusively to Locked On Sports Today. On March 20th at 7 p.m. Eastern, be the first to get local insight from the MLB local experts of the Locked On Network. Find it on March 20th at 7 p.m. Eastern on the Locked On Sports Today 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube, or also on the free Fire Amazon Fire TV channels app. Now, like I said, the Jets unfortunately have a few harsh realities that they are currently facing. The biggest one is that this team just isn't quite, stacked up against some of the best teams in the West. If we're being honest, the Jets probably rank in the top 3 or 4, but they're not top 1. And I think that's very clear because you look at Dallas, that, at forward and on defense, that team is pretty balanced across all 4 lines. And it's not to say that the Jets aren't, but, Dallas just has a little bit more scoring output, and they have better stars in some key positions. Now, one of the biggest ones where the Jets will always have the advantage is in net, thanks to Brossoit and Hellebuck being outstanding, and especially Hellebuck on his Vezina campaign. Hopefully he wins his second Vezina. That should just about, stamp his ticket to the Hall of Fame at this point. But, on defense and at forward, the Jets, against Colorado, against Dallas, maybe even Vegas, Winnipeg is at a bit of a disadvantage. And I think we've seen that reflected in some of these games, more recently than anything, where Winnipeg just hasn't been able to keep up. And it kind of coincided with the return of Connor, unfortunately. As much as I love Connor, I think you have to be honest, ever since he's come back, the team's chemistry has kind of been thrown off. They've tried to force line combos that don't really work together, and I think it's all to accommodate his skill set, which kind of boils down to being the best shooter on the team. But if you're not really getting into those positions to actually take those shots, and instead you're finding yourself, turning over the puck in really weird spots, not being in the right areas to make use of your line mates, being, unaware of certain defensive markings and stuff, that's going to put a lot more pressure on the rest of the team. And with Kyle being such a pivotal part of this team's scoring offense, they've got to find a way to get him going. The best way that they've seemingly gotten him to really get into form is playing him alongside Scheifele and Ehlers. Otherwise, it's just been a little bit of a mixed bag. And so, this team, I feel, has a good foundation for a fun run, but I think the biggest concern is if you see even one injury to one of your best players, it's going to be brutal. The Jets don't really have a lot in the system to come up and replace them, and certainly on the roster right now, they definitely don't. And I'm not saying that you should expect to be able to replace Scheifele or Velarde or any of these guys. That's not what is the case at all. But by the same token, Dallas, they're down Sagan for the most part, and they've still managed to make that team look phenomenal. In fact, they might be even better without him. So it's tough. I mean, the Jets are in a really weird spot where they've got a really high seeding, but they're not quite in that number one spot. And I have a hard time imagining them being able to keep up the playoff pace to actually win the Central if they're struggling against teams like this. Now, the good news is they've got some softer opponents in the next couple of games, but, the Jets are going to have to face some of those playoff squads sooner rather than later. And if they don't get over this hump that they're kind of stuck in against top competitors, it could really bite them in the butt towards the end of the year. I think the last thing the Jets really want to do is kind of miss out on winning the Central and find themselves clambering, in the first round against a team like Dallas or Colorado. You don't want to face those. You want to skip them. Those squads are really nasty. And, the Avs maybe are a team the Jets might have a little bit better of a shot against. But I think the way that Dallas plays is almost like a perfect foil to what Winnipeg wants to do. Dallas can score early and then just basically throttle you for the rest of the game. And that's what they've done so effectively against the Jets forecheck and press that really wasn't able to create much slot offense against them. So the Jets really have to make the most of these next couple of games. They really need to salvage those points in hand. The past couple of losses that they've had, including the Seattle loss, Vancouver, Dallas, now Nashville, they've kind of squandered points opportunities and, granted some pivotal rivals a chance to move further ahead, or in Nashville's case, close the gap a little bit more. Nashville's not catching the Jets necessarily, but certainly you don't want to have them become your eventual opponent because you've slid to like a bad position. So let's just hope that if the Jets do win out, they would probably have to face Nashville as, that should be, I think, the seeding for, the first wild card versus the top seed. So hopefully that's, not going to stick too far back in Winnipeg's crawl. I know the Jets have had at times a short memory, but, I think the most important thing is to sort of round out and get ready for the postseason and hopefully just get healthy. I mean, the team just seems like it's not really been physically well the past month or so. And I don't know what's going on with the locker room health, but I got to say, I've never seen something quite like this. Again, not since that mumps outbreak a while back. And even then, man, like, I don't know. It's just weird. This is atypical to see a flu really wreak havoc like this, especially for such a sustained, period of time. So maybe they need to change the sanitation standards. Maybe they need to change their isolation protocols. I have no idea. Whatever it is, they got to figure it out fast because they don't want to bleed points and find themselves behind the 8 ball by the time the regular season ends. But maybe I'm overstating things. Maybe I'm raising too many red flags. All I know is I'm a little bit worried with how things are trending. And, I think there's a bigger question that I want to talk about. Is this just a passing storm, a short phase, or is this a sign of bigger issues that are going to hurt the Jets in the postseason? We'll talk about that in just a little bit, because I think there's a couple of ways that you could look at this. And, on the one hand, you might think that this is a temporary phase, but on the other, there's some signs and some evidence that there are some bigger structural problems that the Jets might not be able to handle come playoff time. But before we dive into that and get into some perhaps less pleasant conversation, just wanted to let you know it is almost time for March Madness, and FanDuel is your number one spot for online sports betting, especially as we roll into one of the biggest months of basketball. Say goodbye to busted brackets, because FanDuel lets you bet on every single game of the tourney. Whether you're betting on a big upset or a one seed, it's time to go dancing on America's number one sportsbook. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 to use on point spreads, money lines. You can even pick who's going to win it all. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. For those of you who are especially attentive to college basketball, I'm personally not, but this is a great way for you to maybe make use of that knowledge that you've got. Maybe you think you know who's going to pull off the big upset. Maybe you think you know who's going to end up in the Final Four. No matter what, though, be sure to make all of your picks and get your bets in at FanDuel.com/lockdown, where you can win big. Hello, friends, and welcome back to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Folks, I just wanted to wrap up really quickly with some thoughts on Winnipeg's recent run of form and, what this team is really made of, right? What are the Jets when it comes down to it, and are they in a really bad spot? Are they in trouble? Are they likely to just endure a brief phase? Is this a longer-term issue, or, should we be concerned about Winnipeg's postseason run? And I think I'm thinking on both sides of this, right? On the one hand, I think the health thing is just a short-term concern, although it could become a problem if the Jets get to the postseason and they have a serious injury. But in terms of like the flu, that stuff definitely has to work its way out sometime in the next week or two, hoping, sooner rather than later. But I think the bigger issues that I have with this team are how the Jets tend to defend rush opportunities. They really struggle against rush chances, and I think that's been one of the things that opponents have really exploited against them, is that they generate stuff on odd man situations, they create off the rush, they get the inside step, and they also have a really good tendency to exploit plays below the goal line. That's where the Jets are pretty weak, and I think that kind of stuff, especially with rapid puck movement, is really Winnipeg's kryptonite. It's not that the Jets can't play against it and counter it, but Winnipeg this year, I just feel like, has really struggled against that. And if it does continue and teams start getting better at it, I think the Jets could find themselves out of the playoffs really quickly. As good as Hellebuyck is, he can't really defend some of those plays, and that's not really where he's best. He's a big, patient goalie. He's the kind of guy who's not going to be able to cover those posts as effectively on like a 2-on-1. As good as he is a little bit on the slower side at times, and you just don't want to ask something insane of him when he's already giving you so much value in some of the most critical areas, especially inside, when the opponent has possession inside the offensive zone. But for the Jets, I really want to say I have more faith in them, but the past couple of weeks have really kind of shaken my resolve with how I see this team. I just feel like Winnipeg has a couple of big holes, and I'm not seeing some of the guys stepping up to fill those. And I don't necessarily think it's on the team so much as it is some roster decisions that have been made, and frankly, just a general lack of talent compared to some of the top contenders. Thankfully, the Jets have one of the most important pieces in net, but in other areas, Winnipeg is a step behind, and I think that is going to be a tough thing for them to overcome unless, maybe one of the Black Aces arrives and suddenly turns this team around. I think this team at full health is already going to be pretty good. It's just a question of whether those internal upgrades can really turn this team's fortunes around. The Jets are also going to have to figure out what to do with Dillon and Pionk. Honestly, after this game, at least one of them should sit, and it's probably going to be Pionk, right? I know he's not going to get sat for a game. I know that's never happening. But if we're being honest, based on what we saw in this game, and if you really want to send a message, benching Pionk would probably be good. And honestly, maybe he just needs a time off. Maybe he's not feeling, super up to it either, and a game off could do him good. I'm sure a few guys could probably use some time off, but you can only bench so many players before you start finding yourself running real low on reinforcements. So, as much as I want to say that this is just a passing thing, I have a hard time fully buying into that. I think the Jets have definitely put themselves in a tough position, and I think some of the choices over the past couple of months have maybe not given them as much room to breathe as they'd like. Thankfully, the good first half of the season has put them in a really good spot seeding-wise, but unless the Jets can really start taking on these playoff teams, that's not going to really matter much, right? If they make the postseason and they find themselves flattened in round one, well, all of that regular season excellence really doesn't add up to much. Beating up on those bad teams, yeah, not really the best barometer for what we're going to see in the postseason. And so far, the Jets ain't acing that test against playoff teams. So let's really hope for a turnaround in form. I know that you'll look at the record recently and think things are fine, but based on how they've played against some of those top teams, I think we all know it's a little more topsy-turvy and a little bit more uneven than the Jets are letting on. It's a shame, and I really wish it was different, but I think Winnipeg, they've gotten to this point in the season. They just need to find a way to really last these next few weeks. Try and win, go for the win in the Central, make your wild card opponent a little bit easier than having to face off against either of Dallas or Colorado. And if you survive past the first round, hopefully you get a softer second round opponent and a conference final opponent that's a little more manageable. But that's a lot of steps ahead. The Jets still have a ton of work to do to finish out this regular season. They have still got to get Velarde back at some point. From what Bones said, he's not going to skate for the next few days. That does worry me a little bit. I saw somebody, maybe it was Mark or another commenter, suggest that it was a back injury. That was a suspicion. Whatever it is, it's definitely concerning. And I think with Velarde's lengthy injury history, the more time that he misses, the more you should start to be a little bit concerned about his health for the remainder of the year. But, at least they've said it's not, seemingly long-term. He's working out, so it can't be too serious, but he's definitely not back skating yet. And that is a little bit of a disconcerting sign. But let's hope for a quick recovery for him and for Scheifele. This team definitely needs both of them back at full strength heading into what's going to be a very difficult playoff run. But, that's what you buy the tickets to the dance for. If you're not going to be willing to put it out there and go for it, it is what it is. You're going to find yourselves out, maybe in the first round, but all I hope is that the Jets swing big and make as much noise as they can along the way. And they could do a lot more and help us feel a little bit better about it if they can start beating some of these teams that they might see in the playoffs. Hopefully they can find that way to, force these squads and come out with a couple of points, but we'll see. Maybe, the Anaheim Ducks, I believe, are at the end of this week. Maybe that'll be a nice, easy opponent to beat up on and restore at least a little bit of confidence. But let me know how you're feeling about the Jets' recent run of form. Are you worried about how they've played recently? Are you thinking things are okay? Drop your thoughts and feelings in the comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that is going to be all the time that we have. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day, every day. We'll see you back here tomorrow previewing the Ducks game and perhaps checking in on how the rest of the league is doing. But like I said, that's all the time that we have for today. Thanks for listening. Have a great night. And as always, go Jets, go.